What I'm presenting here is probably a bit of a pet personal project as much as anything else. For a while, I've been really interested in trying to think of a way of reinventing the five-star film rating process. And this is what I'm presenting here is really just a sort of work in progress. And I thought I'd share with you the sort of the journey of thinking we've gone through to look at this topic and where we're going with it and what the outcomes, what we've learned from it. But it's definitely a learning process, and I'm very keen to know what people think about some of these things that we've been exploring. And I'm open to any ideas. So you know, do shout me out any feedback if you have any thoughts on some of this. My ambition is to redesign or find a better way of rating things, and it obviously begs the question why. And this is the reason why. Every single film you seem to go to see has 4 stars. It's astonishing, really. Nearly every single film that, certainly in UK cinemas last year, the top 50 films, every single one of them got 4 stars. And if you look at the distribution of film ratings on the IMDA Film Review Score database, nearly 80% of them score between 3.5 and 4.5. We've almost forgotten about the 1 and 2 stars. It may as well be a 3-star scoring system. If you think about it, only 5% of people are clicking on 1 or 2-star choices. And this is a wider cultural problem that affects just about every range question in every survey we ever ask. That we have this significant misbalance of data around the 3 and 4 mark. You know, so for example, if you ask someone what they think about something, a huge majority of people will say that they slightly agree or they quite like it. And from a research point of view, that leads to very middling, poorly differentiated data that I can't really understand and make head or tail of. I mean, this is a lovely example of some brand associations from a real survey. I won't tell you what the survey is, but asking for what words they associated with this particular brand, and just about every single word scores between 3.5 and 4. And so I started to think, well, why is this? Why do all range choices deliver back such neutralized scores? And thinking specifically about the film scoring system, we started to explore some of the factors that generated these types of normalized responses. And I mean, there's some obvious things. For example, non-response bias in films in particular. We mostly only watch films we like, and therefore, that's inevitable that those films will score higher than perhaps the average films. And we're perhaps potentially more motivated to rate films we enjoy. But we have a common problem with all forms of brand evaluation, in that most brands are designed to make you like them, and therefore we have a natural propensity, a similar sort of issue, we have a natural propensity to like things, which leads to opinions being clustered around the top end of the scale. If you actually think about a rating process, it's actually really quite a complicated piece of thinking. I mean, there's all manner of things that could go into making a decision about how you'd rate a film, and these are just a few of them I'm showing you here. And we did an experiment. We asked people a straight question: did you enjoy a film they'd seen? And another group we asked to rate the film. And when you ask people whether they enjoyed it, it's almost an instantaneous response. They can tell you yes or no straight away. In this experiment we ran, 90% of people gave an answer in under half a second. When you ask people to rate something, it's a more complex piece of thinking. It takes anywhere between 2 and 10 seconds for people to do. The answers are not so instinctive because it's a complex and subjective process. And what I've done is had a look at a lot of the feedback about films, and what is clearly apparent is there are social language associated with films and the scoring system we use. It's evolved, this scoring system, to mean 5-star means that I endorse this film and publicly endorse it and would encourage other people to see it. 4 stars basically means I personally enjoyed it, but I wouldn't want to necessarily advocate this film, and I don't know what you'll think of it. 3-star films ultimately means the film was a bit of a letdown or something that not quite right about the film. That it was okay, and then the 1 and 2 stars are simply used for warnings. Don't see, and so because roundabout. When you ask people whether they enjoyed a film or not, around about 80% of people say they enjoyed it. They end up, therefore, plumping for that 4-star option. There's another issue which concerns me, is that rating anything is a sort of an analytical thinking process. It invokes a judgment, an intellectual judgment, and it often overrides perhaps more emotional reactions. It's a very blunt tool, and the way we intellectualize things is something that men have a particular propensity to do. And what that happens is that we discount our emotional reaction. And to test this sort of thought out, what I did is I asked people to rate a film, and then I asked them after that to rate how well they thought the film was made and how much they enjoyed it on a 2-dimensional scale. And they placed them in this metrics, and we looked at the correlation between the ratings and how well made and ratings and enjoyment. And what we saw, and perhaps it's a slight difference, but a measurable difference, was that how well made more closely correlated with the star rating than enjoyment, which perhaps explains why, for example, rom-coms don't win Oscars, because they're often, we discount how they're not necessarily brilliantly well-made films, but we enjoy them, and therefore we discount the enjoyment. And so that might explain why dramas and thrillers and musicals, which more obviously well-made, can pick up Oscars, and perhaps why things like horror films, rom-coms, and comedies don't perform so well, because we just don't like to. Our emotional response is discounted. So, in summary, a lot of films we see we like, and therefore we're likely to score them high. It's a complex thinking process. Scores are a social language, and we make these judgments very analytically, and the result is ultimately meaningless, homogenized data. So what I set out was to think about, well, how could we create a more effective rating protocol? And that started really by thinking about what do people want from an evaluation process. And this is an interesting question, not to ask about a film, but also about any rating scale that you use within a business. If you ask people, consumers, and I did a very, you'll see from my sample below, a very in-depth study on this topic, including interviewing my mum. What I discovered that what people like about the star rating system is it's very simple and easy to interpret it. But what it lacks is any form of context. 4 stars compared to what? And it's not flexible enough to take account of genre. The way that we evaluate thrillers and rom-coms and art house movies is slightly different. There's a need for a system that can be trusted and is objective, but also takes account of people's personal taste and preferences. Because if I read a review and a star rating in, say, a newspaper I don't particularly trust, I discount the value of that rating score. And I need to have to trust that the person rating it has got the same sorts of opinions as me. Ultimately, what I want is an assessment of the risk involved about whether I'm going to go and see a film, and some understanding of what a film will offer me, and clues to how I'm actually potentially going to enjoy a film. But what we also want is something that's very pragmatic and not patronizing. The alternative to star ratings is long reviews, and often those things don't cut through to people because they find those sorts of the review type process patronizing. So looking at this from a research perspective, what we began to explore were these 5 avenues. We started thinking about using more descriptive scales, more creative questioning approaches. Then we began to think about some alternative judgment dimensions that we could invoke. We then looked at more comparative evaluation techniques, and ultimately, the one I think I'm going to sort of champion is a linguistic scoring system, which I'm just going to briefly run through some of the experiments we did and some examples of what we learned from this. We started out literally just playing around with the scales, trying to think of about more emotionalized scales, scale choices, and different ways of asking them to evaluate things that in terms that meant something a bit more to people in the context of a film. And I've done this in various different workshops. We played around with different ideas, and the problem is I constantly end up with feedback which is just as wonky and ill-distributed as a traditional rating scale. I mean, these are just some examples of some of the experiments we've run and dismissed, and I've never really found a satisfying answer to just working on the rating scales. We then started to extend that out in slightly more creative ways. We thought, well, how about a multi-choicey type approach where we had this creative idea of asking people to put imaginary stickers on film covers, and they could pick from a great array of different stickers, and then we ended up with a sort of a more multi-dimensional evaluation process. But what we're finding is again, we get lumpy bits of selections of particular things that are more emotionally resonant than others, and it was producing very messy data that we couldn't interpret, so we kind of dismissed that technique. Then we went on to play around with all manner of more creative rating scales, more emotive rating scales, and these are some examples. Now, these are really good techniques if you're asking people to do a repetitive task or when they're bored in the middle of a survey, but the problem you face with evaluating a film is not a boredom issue. People are happy to think about it. It's just that it just doesn't quite. So the value of this type of more creative questioning technique is discounted somewhat. It's not really the problem we're trying to solve to get people to concentrate on giving the review. It's just getting to think in the right sort of way. So whilst they're nice, these are really great techniques for making surveys more interesting for respondents. They're not solving the problem here of actually trying to develop a more balanced rating protocol. We then began to play around with, sorry, I skipped a slide, a number of different alternative measurement dimensions. I was very interested in this concept of a film, whether a film meets people's expectations. What we discovered is that if a film didn't meet people's expectations, it was really badly downrated by people, and it's a language that people, I think, thought people could understand. And evaluating a film in multiple dimensions on the level of expectations, well, it's a nice idea, but unfortunately it delivered just about as flat data as we were getting from a basic rating protocol. And we played around with a couple of little things, like we're asking things projectively, for example, asking people to how many people would like a film, and we found that delivered very fuzzy data. We couldn't really understand what it meant at all because it was a bit random what we were getting the feedback about their assessment of how many people would like it. Then what we looked at was more choice-based assessments, sort of conjointy style approaches, where we asked people to what films have they watched, what comparative films have they watched, and then we asked them to pick the ones that they most recommend and least recommend. Now this actually began to produce some very interesting, well-differentiated data. I mean, this is a sort of monadic ratings star scoring system for these five or six movies. When you actually ask them to do it choice-based, you start to see quite significant differences and basically the better films start to emerge. Now, this potentially is a really nice way of doing this, but it ultimately is a very impractical way to do it because it basically relies on presenting people with a portfolio of films that they've already seen, and that's a complex process. It's really important to have comparative films. So whilst it's a great technique, it's a very complex thing to apply. So we thought, well, how can we simplify that? And we thought about simply asking people to do more self-anchored choice spacing. So what we did is we asked people to think of a film similar to the film that they'd just seen or are reviewing, in this case, for example, Gravity and Space Odyssey, and then asked them to contextualize it about whether they thought one film was better or another. Now, this, again, does seem to be quite a nice way of differentiating opinion. The problem is that with this technique, we were again seeing biases towards the film that they'd just seen over the film that they were comparing it against. To a degree, it was quite significant. Around about 70% of people preferred the film they'd just seen compared to the film they were comparing it against. And because of the complex nature of what it was being compared against, it was very difficult to balance this out and get a measure that we were fairly trustworthy of. So I think there's something in that technique, but I think it needs developing further. Now, the last technique, and I'm really interested and really excited about this method, is a process of linguistic analysis. I was lucky enough to be able to piggyback onto a big, long international study, a question where I asked people to review the last film that they'd seen and give it a star rating. And what we did is we did some detailed analysis of the language that they were using to describe the film. And we processed it up, and we began to quantify it, into the levels of accolades, and we were able to differentiate different issues, like people talking about how it made them feel and how it made them think, and delivering praise, and then making observations and levels of complaint and so on. And these are all associated with different levels of star rating. So often when people didn't have anything positive to say about a film, they might make some, a statement like, well, I didn't really like it that much, but it was well directed. And so we began to be able to pull apart linguistically an understanding of how good a film was by the language that they were using. And we then began to classify it in more detail. And we built what might be described as an enthusiasmometer, which is basically a sentiment analysis tool on steroids, where literally every single word has been classified and coded very vertically within the topic of films. And so we had a point scoring system for different words. I don't want to sell this as being a complicated process. It was a relatively straightforward coding protocol with some sort of logic to deal with things like double negatives. And then what we did is we mapped that out against rating scores to see how effective it was. And what we could see was that this rating system began to map out and correlate very closely with the rating scores that were delivering back. That's probably obvious because that was what the source material of the rating was based upon in the first place. But what we did next was to think, well, let's try and build this up a little bit more. And what we did is we took all the primary words that people have been using, the phrases, and we pulled out about 200 of them, and we asked people to literally rate how important they thought that. Would you like to see a great film or a good film? Which of these films? We presented it back. We got them to recode and rescore the words based upon the emotional reaction that they generated amongst real respondents. And then we developed a sort of a net promoter style positive and negative sort of scoring process where we subtracted the negative words from the positive words. And from that, we began to really be able to pull apart different opinions about films. And this is a differentiation, this is a comparison of a rating scoring system versus this revised linguistic scoring system. And it really began to really pull apart stronger differences of opinion and more nuanced differences of opinion. And we thought, wow, this is really interesting. But what the beauty of language and looking at linguistic analysis is, it can tell you a lot more than just how the film rates. You can start understanding why. You can start understanding elements of what was making the film good. Was it funny, or the special effects was something to do with the plot or the storyline or the direction and so on. And we began to look for tracer words and map out all the different ways that the films were being described, and we classified them up. And these are some examples of some of the classifications we began to do, and we began to score things like levels of humour and so on. And then we began to build some sort of standardized clusters, so humour, action, drama, tension. These were very commonly referred to metrics that we could analyze statistically. And we began to then be able to paint a picture of a film, not just on how much people liked it, but why. So, for example, was it generating an emotive reaction from respondents, or was it a cognitive reaction? Was it something touching them intellectually or at the heart? And a lovely example of that is comparing two films that both scored almost identical scores in the rating scales. But when you look at the differences in how people react to these two films, it's quite astonishing. Twilight Breaking Dawn, the language associated with it was exclusively emotional, whereas The Hunger Games, it was a significant proportion of reason amongst that and far less emotion. and you know, that, I think that's a really interesting difference there. And we then thought about, well, we can use this as a descriptive tool. So you can say, you know, a film like Iron Man, what makes Iron Man a good film? Well, it's got better acting, it's got better action, and it's actually got more story than most action films. Elysium, that's a better film because it's better directed and it's got better storylines. Ted scores an index of 159 for tension. And it's a combination of tension and humor. The humor scores above the average, so that makes that a successful film. But you're kind of on edge. You don't know what radical thing they're going to do next. The Life of Pi, the highest indexing film we measured for visual appeal. High levels of tension and significantly high levels of the drama. Now, I ask you, you're going to see a film. Would you like to know whether this film scored 4.5 points or whether it scored 200 on visual appeal? I think that these become more valuable metrics for me to interpret a film. And I really do think this has got potential to develop on all sorts of levels, not just about films. And so what we began to do was to extend that out, and we've started to apply some of these techniques to different areas. What we've learned from this whole process is that there's a lot of potential here with this thinking that can be taken into different territories. And the challenge is not necessarily about substituting a measure of a rating scale, but trying to work out how to enhance it and make it more meaningful through better contextualization and delivering back more multi-dimensional feedback that's relevant to particular things you're measuring. But what you ultimately need is something that's very simple to do and easy to understand and easy to process. So this has been such a successful set of experiments. We're now rolling this out we've just mapped out the language of music, and we're mapping out the language of advertising in similar fashion. And we're beginning to map out the language of brands and why people buy certain things. We're beginning to do this in some different languages. We're just about to analyze the same film data in German and French. We're working on developing some infographics to present some of this sort of more detailed information. I think this is quite interesting, an area of how you communicate these sorts of thoughts, and we're going to plan to do some experiments to test this out. And I'm hoping to write perhaps a more significant paper on some of these learnings. So it was really that was a quick run through, and I appreciate I maybe run over a little bit, but I hope that's you found it interesting, really, as much as I have in doing this process, and some seed thoughts for something you might want to do yourselves in the future in your own research. Thank you.